All right, ready to dive into a philosophical rabbit hole.
Always up for a good rabbit hole.
You send in some excerpts about Al-Ghazali and his argument for occasionalism.
Oh, right, yeah.
Now this might sound a little wild at first.
It can be a bit mind-bending.
Yeah, but trust me, it gets you thinking about reality in a whole new way.
For sure.
Ready to explore the idea that God might be the only cause in the universe.
Oh, absolutely. It's a concept that's challenged philosophers for centuries.
Yeah.
And it still has the power to make us question our most basic assumptions about how the world works.
Okay, so let's break this down a little bit. The excerpts that you sent in mentioned this example of fire burning cotton.
Right.
Al-Ghazali seems to be saying that it's not the fire's heat or nature that makes the cotton burn, but God's direct action. So I'm trying to wrap my head around this. So fire isn't actually hot on its own.
That's the crux of Al-Ghazali's argument. He's saying that we see fire and burning happening together, so we assume one causes the other. But he challenges us to think, what if that connection isn't as straightforward as it seems?
Okay.
What if it's God who causes both the fire's potential to burn and the cotton to actually ignite?
I see where he's coming from. But part of me still wonders, does that mean our understanding of science is completely off?
Yeah.
Like, why bother figuring out how fire works if it's all just God doing the burning?
That's a great question,
Yeah.
and one that Al-Ghazali himself addressed.
Okay.
He wasn't denying the value of observing the natural world or the usefulness of science. What he was saying is that science gives us a description of how things work,
Right.
but doesn't necessarily reveal the ultimate cause behind those workings.
So it's more like science helps us understand the mechanics, but God is the engine driving it all.
Exactly. And that brings up another interesting point. This idea challenges our concept of what a cause really is.
Okay.
For Al-Ghazali, it goes beyond just one thing leading to another in a chain reaction.
Right.
It's about recognizing God as the constant and active force behind everything that happens.
Okay. So if we followed this line of thinking, then what happens to free will?
Right.
If it's all God's action, does that mean my decision to eat this cookie right now is really God's decision?
That's where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
Because if God is causing every single event, where does human choice fit in?
Right.
Does it even exist? Al-Ghazali was arguing against other philosophers of his time who believed that God created the universe and its laws, but then let it run on its own like a clockmaker winding a clock.
So those philosophers thought that God set things up, but then we had the freedom to make our own choices within that system.
Right. But Al-Ghazali rejected that, arguing that God is constantly involved,
Okay.
that every moment and event is a direct expression of his will, and that includes our choices.
Okay, wait, I'm getting a little bit lost here. If God causes both my desire for the cookie and the action of me eating it, is there even a difference? Help me out here.
I can understand the confusion. This is where things get really nuanced and have sparked debate for centuries. Let's unpack it. Some scholars interpret occasionalism as meaning we're basically puppets with God pulling the strings.
Right.
But others argue that it's more like God gives us the capacity for choice within a grand plan that only he fully understands.
Okay.
So we have a role to play, but it's ultimately orchestrated by a higher power.
Okay, that makes it a little bit less deterministic and robotic.
Right.
But I'm still grappling with the idea that my choice to eat this cookie or to wear this shirt is somehow part of God's grand plan.
It's definitely a mind-bending concept.
Yeah.
Al-Ghazali uses this analogy of choosing between two identical dates.
Okay.
Imagine they look, smell, and feel exactly the same. There's no logical reason to prefer one over the other.
Right.
But you can still choose.
Right.
He uses this to illustrate that our will isn't just about reacting to the world, but about something deeper.
So even when there's no clear reason to choose, we still have that ability, and he connects that back to God's will.
Exactly. He's saying God has that same power of choice, but on a cosmic scale.
Right.
Just as you can choose between identical dates, God chooses how things unfold in the universe, even when there's no predetermined reason for it.
That's a really intriguing way to look at it.
Right.
But if everything is ultimately God's choice, does that diminish our own sense of responsibility for our actions?
That's a key question, and one that theologians and philosophers have wrestled with for centuries. Some argue that recognizing God's overarching will can actually lead to greater moral responsibility.
How so? Wouldn't it be easy to just say, well, God made me do it?
That's where the concept of surrender comes in. It's not about relinquishing responsibility, but about aligning our will with God's. It's about striving to make choices that are in harmony with the divine plan, even if we don't fully comprehend it.
I can see how that could be a powerful motivator for ethical behavior. But it also raises questions about how we can know what God's will is in any given situation.
Absolutely. That's where faith, reflection, and spiritual practice come into play. Different religious traditions offer guidance on discerning God's will, whether through scripture, prayer, or communal wisdom.
So occasionalism isn't just a philosophical theory. It has real implications for how we live our lives,
Yeah.
how we make choices, and how we understand our place in the universe.
Exactly. And it challenges us to consider the possibility that even our most basic assumptions about cause and effect might not be as straightforward as they seem. It prompts us to look beyond the surface and contemplate the deeper forces at play in our lives and in the world around us.
Okay, so going back to the excerpts that you sent, I noticed there's a lot of emphasis on God's power and sovereignty. What was Al-Ghazali trying to achieve by arguing for occasionalism? Was it purely a philosophical exercise?
Not at all. Al-Ghazali was a deeply religious thinker, and his philosophical arguments were deeply intertwined with his faith. By emphasizing God as the sole cause, he was essentially affirming God's absolute power and presence in every aspect of creation.
So for him, occasionalism was a way of deepening his own understanding of God and expressing his devotion.
Precisely. It was a way of recognizing God's complete and utter sovereignty over all things. It was a theological statement as much as a philosophical one.
That makes sense. But it's worth noting that not everyone agreed with him, right? Even within Islam, there were other interpretations of God's relationship to the world.
Absolutely. Occasionalism wasn't universally accepted within Islamic thought, and there were other schools of thought that offered different perspectives on God's role in the universe. Al-Ghazali's work was part of a larger conversation, a debate that's continued for centuries.
So even within a single religious tradition, there can be diverse interpretations of complex theological concepts, like occasionalism. It's a reminder that these aren't just abstract ideas, they're part of ongoing discussions and debates within living faith communities.
That's a crucial point. Theology isn't static, it's constantly evolving as people grapple with these profound questions about God, the universe, and the human condition.
It sounds like occasionalism was, and continues to be, a catalyst for those kinds of deep reflections.
Definitely. And it speaks to the enduring power of Al-Ghazali's work. Even centuries later, his ideas are still provoking discussion and challenging us to reconsider our assumptions about reality, causality, and the very nature of being.
It's fascinating how an 11th century philosopher can still make us question things we take for granted in the 21st century.
It speaks to the timelessness of these big questions about God, the universe, and our place in it all.
Well, on that note, I think we've covered a lot of ground here. We've explored the basic concept of occasionalism, delved into its implications for free will and responsibility, and even touched on its theological significance. I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed in a good way.
It's a lot to take in, and it's the kind of topic that warrants further exploration and contemplation.
Definitely. For our listeners, I hope this deep dive has provided a taste of the richness and complexity of Al-Ghazali's thought.
I think it has, and hopefully it sparked some curiosity and a desire to learn more.
Now, before we wrap up, I want to touch on one last point that came up in these excerpts. You mentioned earlier that Al-Ghazali was pushing back against other philosophers who believed in a more hands-off approach to God's role in the universe. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Certainly, the view that Al-Ghazali was arguing against is often called deism. It suggests that God created the universe and its laws, but then stepped back, allowing it to run on its own without further intervention.
So it's like God set the clock in motion and then walked away.
Exactly. Deists believed in a God who was a creator, but not necessarily an active participant in the day-to-day workings of the universe. They emphasized the role of reason and natural laws in explaining phenomena rather than appealing to supernatural explanations.
And Al-Ghazali saw that as a problem.
Yes, he strongly disagreed with this deistic perspective. He believed it undermined God's absolute power and sovereignty. He argued that if God simply created the universe and then left it to its own devices, it would imply limitations on God's knowledge and control.
So for him, a hands-off God wasn't truly God.
Precisely, Al-Ghazali believed in a God who is constantly involved, actively sustaining and orchestrating every aspect of creation.
It's fascinating how these different philosophical views reflect different understandings of God and God's relationship to the world.
Absolutely. And it highlights the diversity of thought that existed even within a single religious tradition like Islam.
This has been a truly enlightening conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. I feel like I've gained a whole new appreciation for Al-Ghazali's thought and the enduring relevance of these philosophical questions.
It's been my pleasure, and I hope it encourages our listeners to continue exploring these fascinating ideas on their own.
I second that. And to our listeners, remember, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep those brains buzzing. We'll catch you on the next deep dive. It really highlights how even centuries-old ideas can still resonate with us today. Diving into Al-Ghazali's work with you has made me realize something. We often think of science and religion as being at odds. But maybe there's more common ground than we realize.
I think you've hit on something important. Al-Ghazali wasn't against reason or observation.
Right.
He used logic and analogies to support his ideas. What he challenged was this idea that the physical world operates independently of God.
So it's not about, denying science, but understanding it within a broader framework that includes God's will.
Precisely. Our scientific explanations are incredibly valuable, but for Al-Ghazali, they don't necessarily tell the whole story.
Right.
There's always the question of what lies beyond what we can observe. What's the ultimate source of the patterns and laws we see in the universe?
And for Al-Ghazali, that source is God, which brings us right back to occasionalism. The idea that everything we perceive as cause and effect is actually God's direct action.
Right, yeah.
It's a pretty radical way of seeing the world, completely dependent on God at every moment.
It certainly is, and it raises more questions than it answers, but that's what makes it so compelling. It makes us re-examine our assumptions about how the world works,
Right.
about reality itself and our place in it all.
Whew. This has been a mind-bending deep dive. It's
Mhm.
it's given me a lot to ponder, that's for sure.
It's the kind of topic that stays with you and I. I think that's Al-Ghazali's legacy. Even something as simple as fire burning cotton becomes a doorway to these deep philosophical and theological questions when viewed through his lens.
For our listeners, I hope this has been a taste of how thought-provoking Al-Ghazali's ideas can be. It's a reminder that sometimes the most profound insights come from grappling with ideas that might seem strange or even counterintuitive at first.
I couldn't agree more. Exploration and open-mindedness are key.
Thank you so much for guiding us through this deep dive. It's been an absolute pleasure.
The pleasure was all mine.
And to our listeners, keep those brains buzzing, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.